and that's the Saving Access to Laboratory Services Act, or SALSA. SALSA is bipartisan and bicameral, which means it's been introduced in both the House of Representatives and the Senate. Legislation that would make permanent reforms to the CLFS to protect labs from drastic unintended reimbursement cuts and ensure access to critical diagnostic tests for patients going forward. So SALSA addresses the prior discrepancies in private payer data that Aaron spoke about by requiring reporting from a statistically valid sample of applicable laboratories across the entire laboratory market for widely available clinical diagnostic tests. Widely available tests are specifically those that cost less than $1,000 and are offered by more than 100 providers. So this reporting doesn't apply to ADLTs and other non-widely available tests that retain the current PAMA reporting requirements under SALSA. The statistical sample requirement would ensure that fewer labs need to report their private payer data, significantly reducing the administrative burden on labs, while also ensuring that there is no under or over reporting by any individual laboratory sector. Reporting is also required under SALSA every 4 years, whereas under PAMA, it is required every 3 years. So that would reduce the burden on laboratories as well. Though, as we know, there have been delays and freezes going back the last few years. And last, Medicaid managed care rates are excluded from the applicable data for SALSA. There is a lot of support for SALSA. It's been endorsed by more than 70 patient and provider organizations who have been working tirelessly to draw attention to this issue in Congress and make sure that laboratories are protected. SALSA's bipartisan sponsors, so those individuals in the House and Senate who introduced the bill and who are really carrying the water on it, are deeply committed to addressing PAMA cuts, and they've used opportunities in the committees on which they serve and otherwise in Congress to draw attention to this issue and to try to advance long-term PAMA reform through SALSA. There are currently a total of 65 bipartisan co-sponsors in the House of Representatives and 5 in the Senate, all of whom understand that Congress really must act to protect laboratories and patients from ongoing PAMA cuts. But that said, there are some barriers to SALSA. So for one thing, if you follow Congress at all, you know that moving any type of legislation is an uphill battle. In addition to partisan disagreements on policy and overall priorities, everything that Congress advances must receive a score, it's what's called a score, from the Congressional Budget Office, or CBO. And what a CBO score is, it's an indication of the estimated cost that a piece of legislation will have for the federal government. So how much implementation costs the government over a period of time, specifically 10 years. So the cost that's assigned to a proposal, whether it's positive or negative, has a huge bearing on where it's placed in Congress's list of priorities. Proposals that are estimated to cost the government money must be countered by policies that save money or produce revenue, which are called offsets. So SALSA has cleared one important hurdle by collecting support from both Republicans and Democrats, which can be rare. But when it comes to the cost to implement the bill, things get a little more difficult. While SALSA hasn't been officially or formally scored by the CBO, CBO did provide an informal estimate that indicated SALSA would cost the federal government more than $6 billion over 10 years. So that's a pretty heavy price tag for a piece of legislation. Without an offset to counterbalance that expense, SALSA has stalled in Congress despite its popularity across the aisle and recognition that long-term PAMA reform is essential. On the flip side, in recent years, CBO has estimated a savings for delaying PAMA cuts by 1 year. So as Aaron mentioned, this has helped result in a few temporary reprieves over the past 4 or so years from PAMA cuts. So again, this year, CBO has estimated that a 1-year delay or a freeze to PAMA cuts for 2025 would save the government about $3.3 billion. So that proposal has gained traction in Congress, both to protect labs temporarily and also recoup some of the savings that can be used for other policies. So that brings us back to the action taking place in Congress today, which Aaron mentioned, that a delay to cuts next year is included in the continuing resolution that we expect Congress to pass before the end of the day today. So what's next? While we note that the high cost of SALSA is a barrier to passing that full piece of legislation, and we know that there's high probability of seeing a 1-year delay before even the end of today, long-term reform is still needed. And we continue to call on Congress to really address the overall PAMA picture. And there's motivation not just from advocates, but in Congress to do this as well. Typically policymakers are not enthusiastic about a group of advocates coming back year after year to ask for the same thing. They don't want to put, that metaphorical Band-Aid on the issue at the end of every year. So stakeholders and legislators alike really know that they have to get creative and get long-term reform across the finish line as soon as possible. But, taking in all the factors that we've already talked about, a successful proposal will need to both reform the CLFS, without great expense to the federal government. So NILA and our partners, including ACLA and other laboratory groups, will continue to work with Congress on any long-term sustainable solution that will reform PAMA. It's really essential that labs, other providers, and patient groups continue to raise awareness with policymakers about the risks PAMA cuts propose. And so you can do this by telling your own legislators about the importance of diagnostic testing for patients and the irreplaceable value that laboratories bring to the communities that they serve. We're, as Erin said, excited to see that we'll have that 1-year delay going into 2025, but really that's not the end of the story here. And we have to keep working to make sure that Congress acts to address the negative consequences of PAMA.